it's not a frequent thing in this room. Normally, people are engaged in very lively conversations, but evidently they have high expectations for today. So, welcome to this first seminar of the academic year. It's a great pleasure to see so many people in this room. As you know, these seminars are a great opportunity to discuss all sorts of topics that are highly relevant for people like us interested in international affairs broadly defined. And we know that today it can mean a lot. And it's also a good opportunity to get exposure perhaps to topics you don't know much about. And I want to say from the beginning that it is my case today, because I'm certainly not an expert in cyber issues. But precisely it's a great opportunity to learn from those who know. And I think we could have thought of we couldn't have thought of a better person to introduce this topic than Christopher Painter, who has kindly accepted to come and lend his expertise to our discussions. Christopher has been for many years now one of the big minds on cyber issues. He has behind him a very distinguished career in multiple positions that I won't list, it would be too long, but it's important to stress that he has been looking at those issues from very different angles. First, as a federal prosecutor, if I'm not mistaken, so with a focus on problems that may arise and need some reaction from governing authorities. And on the other hand, equally importantly, as a diplomat, acting as, well, I've seen somewhere a reference to him as being the first cyber diplomat, which is a nice way to, let's say, suggest that he's been doing many things in many distinct capacity, advising government, collaborating with a multiplicity of departments in the federal government and at the international level. And this provides him with a kind of very comprehensive picture, which I think is what you need for an introduction. So it's a great honor and a pleasure for me to have him as the first speaker in our seminar series, and I very much look forward to our conversation. You know the rules of the game. I think we will talk for about 30 minutes. Roughly speaking, after which we will have an open Q&A series where you're asked to simply, if you want to take the floor, to introduce yourself very briefly and to make your point fairly quickly, since I expect that there will be many questions. But now the floor is yours. And again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, everybody, it's a great honor to be here. I'm really happy to be only my second time in Bologna, and the first time was very brief. And have had a lot of dealings with Johns Hopkins and SAIS over the years, but it's great to be here. As was introduced, I'm a recovering lawyer, and so normally, to break the ice when you have especially late afternoon when it's rainy outside, you try to break the ice a little bit. And so normally, I would tell a lawyer joke, but the problem with lawyer jokes is that lawyers don't think they're funny and non-lawyers don't think they're jokes. So that's a joke. I'm going to talk about several different things today. I'm going to try to give an overview of what the threats are, both the technical and the policy threats we're seeing in cyberspace, why this is becoming more of an important area, and particularly why this has become a diplomatic concern over the last 10 years. And it's a relatively new field for diplomacy. I think it started about 11 years ago as a diplomatic concern, and I think that is really important, and I'll get into some of that too. I'm also going to see if this works. Nope. Glitch. There it is. Okay. I'm also going to explain what this, which is a bunch of zombies, have to do with this, which have to do with this, which is a bunch of diplomats. This is actually how we used to dress in the State Department in these things. It took a while to get the wigs on and stuff, but what those two things have together. And also, I'm going to explain this. So when I was at the State Department, in particular, when you work in a foreign ministry, usually you go into someone's office and they have a lot of tchotchkes, little things from all over the world, little remembrances of different places they've been. And I want to make our office suite unique as a new office, first time it had been created. And so what I had in the office, much to the chagrin of my deputy at the time, who thought it looked like a dorm room, was having about 40 different movie posters where movies where either hackers or computers were the main characters. And of course, there were things like The Matrix and Terminator and Tron and there's many, I've identified 75 movies now. But my favorite, and I saw this when I was a little kid, was really the first movie where computers took over the world. So 1970 was when this movie was released, just around the time of 2001, so they were neck and neck. And it basically was, the story was that the US builds Colossus, the computer Colossus, to control its nuclear arsenal and take the man out of the middle, the person out of the middle, because they were too subject to emotion, so have automatic responses. And the Soviets, because back then it was the Soviets, they stole the information. They built their own computer system in the Urals called the Guardian. And the two computers became self-aware and started talking to each other and decided to protect humankind from itself, that they would take over the world and take away all civil liberties and make the world more secure. So that dystopian movie, like almost every cyber movie is dystopian, but early on, long before war games or other movies where computers are painted as this giant, maybe opportunity, but also hazard. So I'll come back to that at the end, but that's just to set up. Okay, so, Bernard mentioned my background. I have been doing cyber things for about over 30 years now, which is hard to believe. So before there was a World Wide Web, not before there was an internet, but before there was a World Wide Web, my first computer was a Atari 800 with a cassette tape drive, so that shows how old I am. No one cared about these topics for a long time, or just a small clique of people did, and people weren't as dependent as they were on it now. And I have seen different perspectives. So I've seen it as a prosecutor, I've seen it as an official in the White House. I was at the National Security Council helping the Obama administration put together the policy in this. And then I was at the State Department, and it was the first time a foreign ministry had an office like that anywhere. And that was really important in terms of transforming this issue, which is often seen as a very technical issue or an issue for either law enforcement or technical authorities, to more of a policy issue. Obviously, and that informs my overall view. So I've seen it from different perspectives. The law enforcement perspective obviously was the crime perspective, but every job I took, I got a broader perspective on the issues, including the human rights aspects, the privacy aspects, the nation state and diplomacy aspects. And so I think as I look at this over the years and where it's going in the future, that helps inform where I am. As you all know, we become, one of the reasons that people care about it now. Back when I was a prosecutor, I did a criminal case of a hacker named Kevin Mitnick, who was very famous, there have been some books and bad movies written about him, but he was a hacker who was on the run for about a year and a half as we were trying to track him, and broke into about 60 different companies and governments around the world, and we finally caught him. But back then, people thought hackers were these romantic characters, kind of Robin Hoods. There was a banner flying over the courthouse while we were doing the sentencing for him, where he ended up pleading guilty, which said "Free Kevin." And so people thought that was a big thing. They didn't really understand how this really harmed them. And I think now, as you all know, we're so dependent on these technologies for social communications, for finance, for government, for even warfare, that these intrusions, I think people take much more seriously. Now, do they stay top of mind all the time? No, but I think that has changed the game. And when we look at the various threat actors, there's a range of different threat actors out there. There are nation states, and the nation state motivations are largely either disruption, potentially going after critical infrastructure, or theft of information, espionage. And we've seen both. The top 4 nation states, according to the Director of National Intelligence, have been Russia, not surprising, both capable in intent and programs. China, also not surprising. North Korea, and North Korea is a little weird because their motivation is not just a normal kind of nation-state motivations. They're also trying to make money, hard currency, to send back home. And Iran. And Iran and North Korea, although they're third and fourth, are quickly catching up in terms of tradecraft and others. So those are the 4 nation states. And then you have criminal groups, transnational organized criminal groups, lone gunman hackers like Mitnick was, a range of different folks that are out there. And so, and the criminal groups, obviously, their motivation is money. They don't care about disruption necessarily. They don't care largely about political aims. Now, sometimes criminal groups are acting as proxies of nation states. So we see this with Russia and other countries too, where they're either given safe havens or they're actually acting in direction of the state. And so then their motivations differ. A good example of some of the criminal activity where the proxies come up a little bit is ransomware. And I'd say ransomware, which I think everyone kind of knows by now what ransomware is, but it's essentially these hackers who get into computers, they steal data, they lock the computer down, they ransom you. They say, give us money or else we will not unlock it. You won't have access to your files. And this has been very disruptive. It's been targeted at hospitals, at governments, and others. The silver lining is because that is so apparent, it's raised the bar. It's made this much more of a national level priority because people understand disruption in a way they don't understand data theft. Because data theft happens, and you may not see it operationalized for several years. So ransomware, I think, is big, but even there, the ransomware groups sometimes are independent, and sometimes they act either at the behest of a nation state or with the protection of a nation state, which we've certainly seen in the case of some of them in Russia. Then you have the issue of nation-state activity, and some of the key things. There's been many different examples of this. There was something called the NotPetya worm that Russia was responsible for that caused widespread damage in Europe and other places. The WannaCry worm, which was North Korea. The NotPetya worm shut down Maersk's shipping worldwide for some time, so it had very major consequences to it. So you have these different ranges, and then recently you've had what they call Bolt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, which are some of the Chinese intrusion sets. One is more espionage, and espionage happens, right? Countries do espionage. They've done espionage since the beginning of time. They'll do espionage till the end of time, and that's not changing. However, it was very clever in the way it was done. We had a similar incident when I was still in government where the Office of Personal Management was attacked, and they took all of our security clearances and other files. And the response of the then Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, was, well, I wish I could have done that. So it is something that is bad, but it's accepted. But there's a different kind of espionage, or there are 2 different kinds. There's that when you're going after intellectual property to benefit your private sector, that's something the U.S. and others feel you shouldn't do, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then you have the kind of more disruptive attacks. You have the Salt Typhoon, which is one which got into infrastructure, critical infrastructure, with the possibility, what we call prepositioning, that you could actually shut that infrastructure down. So that often, if you think about if your electrical grid gets shut down, your financial system gets shut down, that really raises the bar in potential instability. A good example of the intellectual property theft, as I said, was there was a time period where, and it still exists, where certain countries, China is one of them, were being accused of taking wholesale intellectual property from countries, including the U.S., and that led to a negotiation, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But there's lots of that going on, and it's not just traditional espionage, but it's also industrial espionage. And there's this concept of cyber war, which I hate that term because I don't think we're actually going to ever have a standalone cyber war. I don't see why you'd ever have that. We even see this playing out in Ukraine. Yes, cyber is being used in war, and I think we'll continue to see that. And the Russians have used it a lot in Ukraine, both going after Ukrainian systems and communication systems and satellite systems before they actually invaded. But you're not going to use a cyber tool to take out, say, a power plant if you have actual kinetic weapons to do it. You're not going to burn the vulnerabilities and other things that you do. So, but I do think we're going to continue to see cyber in war and done more and more. And then the U.S., particularly recently, has talked about what we call being more offensive in cyberspace. Maybe just being more offensive generally recently, but certainly more offensive in cyberspace in the sense that the U.S. has U.S. Cyber Command. And one of their jobs is to use cyber as an offensive weapon to go after adversaries as one of the tools, military tools. When we were having I used to lead our bilateral dialogue with China on cyber, and we talked to the Chinese about this. We bring DOD and others along, and China said, well, we don't have anything like that, which wasn't really true, but now they do. They actually have declared that they have their own sort of cyber command, and many countries in the world have it. So I think that the increasing use of cyber tools in war raises a lot of issues, including diplomatic and other issues that are going to continue to get more prevalent. And then besides these technical threats, you have really dueling policy narratives and what I call policy threats. So there's a very different, and this is not surprising, view of the world between the West, however you define the West, and Russia, China, Cuba, and others. And you see this play out in the UN and other places where the U.S. has always said, and the West has always said, they want a free, not that everything's free, but a free, open, interoperable, secure internet, and we talk about cybersecurity, where if you listen to particularly the Russians, the term they use is information security. And that's not an accident, because the idea is they're trying to control information. And they are worried about regime stability more than cyber stability, and so they're worried about how that could affect their long-term regime stability. And then finally, I'm not going to talk about disinformation much, because you can spend 2 hours talking about that alone, but that's also an important trend we're seeing, and you all have seen that as well. And then this idea of information control, the Great Firewall of China, other regimes trying to control information. There was a sense that the internet was going to be this democratizing force. I remember Hillary Clinton giving a speech saying, which I characterize as cyber internet, yay! And then 2 years later, she gave a speech was like cyber internet, because countries had learned how to harness this to actually control populations. And so that's a big issue. And to give an example of that is when I was in Beijing at one of the meetings, I saw this in my hotel room, and I thought it was great because it has as you can see, it has all the trademarks and all very nicely written. And I thought, I get to see all these things. And if you look at with the small printing, it says, in accordance with regulations in China, the following websites are not accessible, including but not limited to. So there is a lot of information control going on. So not surprisingly, given how important this has become as a threat factor, both at a policy level and at a technical level, and how much dependent we are on this, there's been a lot of response. And the response for a long time was really predominantly focused on law enforcement response, military response, and technical response, like in the US, the Department of Homeland Security, but ministries in the interior in most other countries. And they were looking at this as a technical threat and just trying to do things with that. But more and more, I think one of the problems is people tend to think of cyber as this boutique area that is just the minion of, or the domain of, people who do programming. And the truth is, just like nuclear or other areas, you don't need to be a programmer. You don't need to be a coder to understand the larger policy implications of this. And policymakers, rather than be afraid of this, should embrace it. But that's hard because they think it's scary, and so they haven't gotten involved in it. But that's changed recently, and I think a part of that is the idea that this is a real diplomatic imperative. One of the things I did at the White House is I helped coordinate the first international strategy of cyberspace that we released. And that international strategy had every component you can think of. It had everything from human rights to economic issues to military issues to security issues under a larger rubric, serving a larger rubric, and it was both an invitation and a challenge to other countries to work with us on those issues. And when Hillary Clinton delivered the speech, every cabinet official delivered the speech at the White House when they released this, she said it was a new diplomatic imperative. And I think that's true because of the necessity for folks to focus on this as an issue. And importantly, to understand that this is not just a technical issue. There are policy concerns around it. And then my office at the State Department was created at the same time. So this is 2011. So this is the first office in the world that was reported to the Secretary of State. Actually, one of the brainchilds of this office was your dean, Jim Steinberg. It was his idea. He didn't want to go to the White House all the time and be in meetings where he was the only one raising the diplomatic issues. So he wanted it to be more ingrained in the State Department as a diplomatic issue. Understanding as he was going to these meetings, we were dealing with issues of war, issues of conflict, and we really needed to bring the diplomatic angle to this. And I think this really quickly caught on. Now there are over 50 countries who have diplomatic offices of some form, and they may be structured different places. Some of them are just on security issues. Some of them include digital issues and security issues. Some of them include human rights, digital, and security issues, like my office did in its beginning. The idea was to bring all these things together because they're not silos. You think about human rights in cyberspace, you think about conflict in cyberspace, and you think about economic issues, and they really is a nexus, and you can't just deal with those alone. So that was important that was done. And as you think about the larger role of what does it mean, what does cyber diplomacy mean? Like, you said I was the first cyber diplomat. It didn't mean I was cyber, I'm a human. So, but what does that really mean? And it's really looking at this range of geopolitical and other issues through the cyber lens and dealing with these new technologies. And so to give you some examples of what cyber diplomacy means, one is building coalitions and this typical diplomatic stuff. That's what folks do for collective response and working with other countries to ameliorate threats. So that could be both on a policy level, but also at a technical level. So, as I said, I showed you those two pictures of the zombies and the diplomats, and I will explain what the correlation of that is. So back then, one of the things we had over a year-long period of Iran launching what they call distributed denial of service attacks. So these are essentially zombie computers, that's the way they're described. So computers all over the world that have been compromised by bad guys. And they launch them at a site and knock it offline. Now, is it the end of the world? Is it getting into the integrity of the information? No. Is it taking down things permanently? No. But it's a pretty big deal. This happened in 2007 in Estonia, when the Russians or Russian-aligned groups, it's not ever been clear, went after Estonia and took down their voting and other stuff. But this was launched at a financial institution for a year, several financial institutions. And we knew it was a nation state. So how do you mitigate that? How do you take that down? So we looked at technical ways, we looked at military ways, we looked at law enforcement ways. But the most effective one, because these botnets, as they're called, are all over the world, and there were concentrations in Germany, certainly in the US, Germany, other places in Europe. What we did is we did diplomatic demarches. A diplomatic demarche before I became a diplomat, I thought that was a mean thing. It just sounds mean. You go and yell at another government about something. But this was actually a nice demarche. It was you went in and said, hey, can you help us? You have a collection of these compromised computers. They're attacking us. You don't want them there. We don't want them there. Can you use whatever tools you have to try to mitigate this? And if you do, and even if you don't, but even if you do, we will cooperate with you. We'll create this new mutual system where we go after these shared threats. And that was very effective, and that really worked. It really cut down on the effectiveness of this botnet. And the diplomatic one, I think, was the one that worked almost the best. Another example was Sony Pictures, and I remember North Korea objecting to a really bad movie, which I don't recommend. I didn't have this poster, by the way. It wasn't a good movie. Where it's the first time at the high level, the US government, Obama said it's Iran. I mean, we never did that before. I think a former French, Mitterrand one time did that with a cyber event, but that was a new thing to attribute to this public attribution of an attack to a nation state. And we talked to many countries and say, can you support us? And I called a number of my colleagues in other countries and said, can you help support us do this? And their response was generally positive. Some of them said, well, we'd like to get the information. We'd like to get what you're basing this on. And so that created more, I think, camaraderie and understanding of how that works. And then I talked about ransomware and what that meant. So, there's something called the Counter Ransomware Initiative, which is now 65 countries that are collaborating to go after ransomware and to deal with ransomware. And so that is another example where there's been collective action to go after a threat. And so that's really important. Then you have bilateral negotiations, which again is just core diplomacy, right? So when I talked about the Chinese theft of intellectual property problem, which one person, the head of Cyber Command, put as the largest theft of property in the history of mankind, I think that's a little extreme, but still said that. So that had been a pervasive problem for a long time. And we finally called it out. Obama said to Xi in his first meeting, look, this is a big problem. I think Xi probably said, why are you raising the cyber problem? That doesn't seem like the biggest deal, but it was important enough that, and this goes to my point about making this a real, no kidding, national security priority, economic priority, human rights priority, which it needs to be, and diplomatic priority. He raised it and said, look, this is it's such a big deal, we're willing to take friction in the overall US relationship. It's a big deal, especially back then when the relationship was much more interdependent than it is perhaps today. And then we followed up, at every turn, we continued to raise this. I had the job in one of our dialogues with China in Beijing of saying, we had this dialogue. Bill Burns was then the deputy. He led it. It was the only joint military civilian dialogue we had. So we had the, people from PACOM, people from DOD. They had the deputy PLA chief. And we said, look, this is the problem. And my job was to sort of read, we know you did this, we know you did this, we know you did this. And their reaction, not surprisingly, is we didn't do that. And kind of not being very happy about it. To this, the Chinese general said, it reminds me of a story of the woodsman who goes into the woods and he loses his axe. And he goes home and he blames the neighbor boy because the neighbor boy just seems like the kind of guy who would steal his axe. But he goes back the next day and his axe is still there and he realizes he was wrong. So in other words, we're mistaken. And I saw him at dinner that night and said, no, it's more like the woodsman who loses his axe. He goes home, he comes back the next day, his axe is still gone, but everyone else has similar axes. So that was and he laughed, to his credit, he laughed. And it took about 2.5 years, but we ended up reaching, I think, a landmark deal where just before Xi came to the US, we had an all-night negotiation with them. And both sides agreed that that was something that was off limits. Originally, the Chinese view was there is no difference between espionage and industrial espionage to benefit our own private sector. And we don't do either. And we got to a point where we said, look, we're not asking for anyone to admit they do things. We're just saying this shouldn't be done. And that was a norm. That was an understanding that was then mirrored in the G20, which was significant. Now, has that lasted? No, not really. And why? It lasted for about 2 years, but the reason I think the sides came together was because they cared about the overall relationship. And as the overall relationship deteriorates, it became less of a priority. And that also goes to the point that cyber can't be seen as this little, pinpoint. It is part of the larger geopolitical relationship. We don't have a Russia cyber problem. We have a Russia problem. We don't have we don't have a problem that's just cyber with any country. You have to look at those larger things. So bilateral negotiations is another, and this also takes place in subnational areas or supranational areas like the G8 and regional bodies in the UN. And another one is negotiating, and a big thing that we did was negotiating rules of the road in cyberspace. Given how unstable this could be between countries, especially with the advent of all these offensive operations, how can we bring some order to this? And so within the UN framework, and it really was a Russian initiative originally to do this, but they wanted a cyber treaty. They wanted a treaty to control cyberspace, which we didn't want, A, because of the content issues I mentioned before, that they were worried about content. B, because it was pretty clear they wanted to constrain the action of other countries and then probably not obey it themselves. And so that was a concern. The US and others had long resisted that. But we came forward with a rationale that we need to build a framework of international law applying in cyberspace, which shouldn't be surprising, but back in 2015, in 2012, there was real debate about that. And even still, I think Russia and China say, yeah, but now you need more. But real debate about whether international law applies. And if you think about it, it's really unstable if it doesn't apply. If you have different rules for cyberspace in the real world, it's problematic. So got agreement in this thing called a group of governmental experts, so 15, all the P5 and others, which was landmark. And then this agreement that there are certain norms of behavior, voluntary but still political commitments, rules of the road. And then the third leg of the stool is confidence building measures. They're really only connection to the nuclear world, where the idea is hotlines to de-escalate and make sure that there's not unintended escalation. Hotlines are one, points of contact. There are a myriad of them. The OSCE in Europe came up with a list of first 11, and now I think it's 22 different confidence building measures, which included Russia, as they talked about that. So that is a very important foreign policy concept that was being applied to the cyber, including we had a bilateral with Russia where we used the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, the hotline, the traditional hotline, which is, by the way, not a phone, it's a computer system, that we use that for cyber too. And so that was significant. And that led, so there was a lot of activity here, including agreement then at successive ones of these small meetings, and then a larger group that, again, Russia proposed, but didn't come out exactly the way they wanted. What's called an open-ended working group. That's every country in the UN that met for first 2 years and then 5 years, like Star Trek, the 5-year mission, they just completed it. And that affirmed, every country affirmed that these norms and this whole framework affected them. They also talked about other things like capacity building. So So I'm not going to read these, but I'll just give you an example of them. So there are two kinds of norms, these voluntary norms. One is, and there are 11 of them. Again, I don't know why they couldn't come up with 10, but it's like Spinal Tap, the movie, if you've ever seen it, they went to 11. There are norms of restraint and there are norms of cooperation. The norms of restraint are things like in peacetime, because wartime, there are rules. There is the international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. There's debate about how those apply to cyberspace, to be sure, but it is appropriate, for instance, to go after railroad tracks in war as long as you have proportionality, you're not going after a civilian target, et cetera. But in peacetime, which is what we're in, kind of, what are the rules that should apply? And so one of them is you shouldn't go after the critical infrastructure of another country in peacetime. You shouldn't do that, and so that provides services to the public. So that was important. Another one is you shouldn't go after the computer emergency response teams, or the CSIRTs, they're called. These are like the ambulances of the hospitals on the internet. It's destabilizing just to do that. You should only use them for good and not to attack other countries. And then there are norms of cooperation, like if malicious code's coming from your country, you have an expectation that if a country asks, you'll help them. You may use law enforcement tools, technical tools, political tools. So I think that was really an advance to get that happen. At the same time, there were also negotiations. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on cybercrime. There was a big UN cybercrime convention that just got passed. I didn't think it would ever happen. There was something called the Budapest Convention that was more the Council of Europe before that, but many other countries beyond that. But there was a push, again, by Russia to have this cybercrime convention, which passed. I don't think Russia got much of what it wanted, but there are certain concerns people have about how that applies. But that's a whole another area. But this area was more on international peace and stability, even though there's a crossover with that. And so you have these various norms, and that's great. The problem is, it's great to have these rules of the road. It's great to have these rules, really. It's great to have international law. We believe in the rules-based international order, at least we hope we do right now, and that's certainly under attack these days. But there really ends up being just words on paper if you have every country in the world, including Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the US, Israel, everyone's agreed to these rules, but they violate them too. So if you violate them and there's no consequences for them being violated, then you're emboldening, you're creating a behavior where it's fine to violate them. You're actually creating a norm that's okay. And so that has been a real problem as we look at this, is how you can deal with this issue of making sure there's some enforcement mechanism. That's unlikely ever going to be the UN, because the Security Council is subject to a veto. It's hard for that to be the enforcement mechanism. There's been a lot of talk about groups of like-minded countries acting together collectively. That's been good. There's been this claim, the reason we can't do that is attribution in cyberspace is hard. There's the dog in front of a computer and says on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. Well, they do know you're a dog, because if you're a nation state that's doing significant attacks over time, you can look at not just the digital trail, but the motivation, intelligence, everything else. And we usually do know in those big ones who's responsible. But still, the people who are responsible often hide behind attribution and say, just like in the physical world. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they had little patches on, so it was a little green men, but in fact, they were Russian. So we're able to do that. But then the question is, if you get beyond that, how do you take collective action that has accountability and deterrence? And there's, again, this could be a whole discussion in itself. Does deterrence really work in cyberspace? And there's some that say it doesn't, and some that say it does. It doesn't in the nuclear sense. I think it does or can if there's more collective action and consequences for bad action, but we haven't seen that really as much as we wanted to. So that's been a major effort, is not just what the rules of the road are, but how do you enforce them, how do you take those forward, both in the UN, but also in regional forums. Capacity building is another effort, which is working with countries around the world to make sure that they have the capacity. And a lot of the countries in the middle, the global south or the global majority or whatever term you use, that's what they really want. They want help building institutions. They want help even building cyber diplomatic tools, offices, but they want help building national level strategies and other institutions, and they feel they're being left behind. And so I think that's been an important area. And frankly, it's also a tool of diplomacy because it's how you win hearts and minds. If you're actually working with a country, maybe they'll support you in other things in your view of the internet and how that works. And that's been a big effort and something I spent a lot of time over the last 5 years helping to run and coordinate internationally. And then, it wouldn't be a talk about cyber without mentioning AI, because you have to mention AI. I think it was written somewhere you have to mention AI. So the idea of, I talked mostly about the cyber stuff. As I said, there's a whole area of digital diplomacy that deals with things like conflicting regulations and involvement and a lot of stuff that comes out of the EU. There's a lot of that, and there's a lot we can say on that, though I won't now, but you can ask questions about it. Everyone is talking about AI, which is important because it does have a possibility of transforming and likelihood of transforming things. And there is a cyber component to it. Both the bad guys are using AI in ways that automate their systems, automate their attacks, make it much harder. We've been worried about that for years. It's finally starting to happen for real now. There's been a lot of hype, but it's starting to happen. The Russians used AI loaded tool to go after Ukraine to actually gather information and exfil it back to Russia, which is the first time we'd seen that. That's been important. So we're going to see AI much more on both sides and what that really means. And then we also have to think beyond the cyber part of this. What are the rules for AI governance? How do you create the right guardrails? How do you think about this in the future? And that's been a very difficult thing when you have the US essentially pulling back from some of its AI orders. You have the EU in terms of its AI Act and how those things mesh and at the same time allow the development of these technologies in an appropriate way. So those are all another aspect of this. And then just to talk about the future briefly, which is, look, this is going to be an area, the good thing is, this is going to be an area of increased focus over the years. This is not going away. For years, I think people were not paying attention to this. Now everyone's paying attention to this. If you're going to go into diplomacy, and I hope many of you do, this is an area that I think is a growth area. One thing I tell folks is that unlike a lot of other areas of diplomacy where you go into a foreign office and you're basically delivering talking points that have been written in the 1940s, this is an area you get to shape where it's going, even as a young person, because the expertise is not really there yet. Even though they've created these offices, you have the opportunity to have much more impact, I think, than you do in others. And again, it's not going away. And so I think that's important. I think there are going to be issues on terms of the UN and multilateral processes. They're certainly under attack. I said the rules-based order is under attack, and I think that leads to a lot of issues. The new Trump administration, I think anyone's guess on a lot of issues on these things, including not having much of it as emphasis on this, but also going after some of the capacity building programs and not funding them and what this means for other countries around the world. So it's going to be an interesting space, as these things unfortunately are, but interesting in the way of like, may you live in interesting times rather than interesting for researchers too to look at this, and it'll be constantly evolving, and there's no shortage of issues here. So with that, I will now tie back to the beginning, which is I showed you the poster of Colossus, the Forbin Project, the dystopian movie where the computers essentially enslaved the world, which I recommend, by the way. It's a great movie. It's kind of kitschy, but it's great. This is the actual Colossus. So in World War II, and you can go to Bletchley Park in the UK and see this, the first digital electronic programmable computer was built, which was Colossus, filled a room, and it was used to break the Nazi Lorenz code. So beyond the Enigma code with the routers and other things, this was far more complex than the Enigma code, and they built this computer to do it. So my end point to you is, look, you can go down the dystopian path, and I hope you don't, and I hope the world doesn't. But computers can also save the world, and I think arguably this computer did. And so that gives me some hope, even as a recovering lawyer. I'm a glass half full kind of guy most of the time. So I recommend you take that approach as you look at these things. And then finally, just some resources. There's a podcast I've done for several years now called Inside Cyberdiplomacy. Now it's called Inside Cyberdiplomacy Redux, and found wherever fine podcasts to be found. Julia over here was, when she was at the Center for Strategic International Studies, helped us with that podcast. So it's been long running, but we interview very high-level diplomats and others around the world, the undersecretaries of the UN and other places, and I recommend it. It's a good, I've heard many of the cyber diplomats say they actually use it as a primer, which is great. So hopefully that will continue. And then just recently, I think it's going to be published actually in October, there's the Paul Grave Handbook on Cyber Diplomacy. I have a chapter in that details what's happened in the US, but it has like 30 different folks, both academics and practitioners who've written chapters, and I recommend that to you as something that will be interesting. And that, I'll stop and take questions. Sorry, we're a little over.
Well, thank you. I think we couldn't dream a better introduction to this mysterious and complex universe that you've been depicting. And I think it's the right time to have this kind of discussion because, as you pointed out, it's, if I understood correctly, no longer, let's say, a field that is in an infant stage. It's being formed. It's been formed for quite some time. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And needless to say, as you pointed out, well, it's a part of international relations that, like the rest, is bound to be affected by politics. So there are many questions that can be asked, but I won't ask all of them, and rather give the floor to people in the audience.
And don't be shy. I don't think you will be shy.
Don't be shy, and we'll start by students. You were the first, I think. Please. Wait for the microphone, otherwise we may be in trouble.
Thank you. Yeah, hi, Mr. Painter. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. My name is Tash, or Tashwata, but I actually spent the last few years working at Bank of America, looking at the payments side. And we spent a lot of time last year, because I worked in Hong Kong, so we looked after India. And the RBI stipulated that they now have this rule where all data regarding payments has to be localized in India itself. So any payments that is originating from India can no longer be stored anywhere outside of India, which obviously meant we had to go through a lot of time and effort to build systems outside of the ones that we had. So is this something that you see as a trend in terms of localization of data versus globalization? Because I know one of their concerns was obviously targeting corruption, but also going back to your point of nation state and sovereignty and things like that. So, yeah.
And thanks for that. This has been a long-standing issue, and I noted on the slide, but didn't really go into it, this idea of data localization. And there's several different aspects of it. One is an understandable view that countries are saying, look, if folks in my country are using a service, say, based in America, for communication, and they're both in my country, and I want to get that data, why do I have to go to the U.S. and go through all of the privacy and other things you have to go through the Stored Electronic Communications Act to get them? Shouldn't I have access to them? And shouldn't that mean you store all the data in my country? And so certainly I've heard that in India. I heard that in Brazil a lot when I was both in justice and in state. There was something that called the Cloud Act. It's another one where they spend a lot of time figuring out what the name was. Congress spends a lot of time figuring out the acronyms of these names, like the Patriot Act and others, rather than actually focusing sometimes on the thing. But the idea was to create a regime where, rather than the situation where you want the data, so this happened in India, actually. They wanted the data. The U.S. firm said, we can't give you the data. And then they put the local executives in jail. That's not, that doesn't help the companies. It doesn't help anyone. So they worked out something where the companies can cooperate without going through all the procedure, but you had to meet certain due process concerns. And so that a number of countries have joined that yet, but it's still a problem because, for instance, when I talked to my Indian counterpart and said, hey, we have this, you can be part of it, they said, well, we're not going to change our law. We're not going to give you any due process concerns. And so that creates still a problem. And when we talked about the cybercrime treaty, or when I talked about it, that was one of the issues that came up. It didn't get resolved, but at least it got teed up. The other issue is data localization for commercial and other purposes. So, well, I should also say, and this also involved India, one of the reasons Jim Steinberg created my office was there was, during the big Mumbai attack, you remember BlackBerry? Anyone remember BlackBerry? So BlackBerry was being used, and India wanted all the BlackBerry server data stored in India for counterterrorism reasons. And literally 4 different parts of the State Department, the human rights part, the security part, the counterterrorism part, all had conflicting statements about that. And I remember Steinberg calling me up and said, I need you over here now. We need to actually have like one view of this. And so that's another aspect. But then the commercial side, there's this idea, as you said, that they want all the transactions. Lots of countries are doing this. The problem is, and the U.S. for years, and not just the U.S., but most of the West for years has argued against that, saying, look, that's not sustainable. You can't do that in every country. And it hurts smaller businesses. Some of the bigger firms might be able to do that. But like smaller financial institutions, they can't possibly do that and survive. And it doesn't even make sense from the perspective of the countries who are asking for it, because that hurts their own institutions who are trying to do business outside. And so that there's been this economic argument for years. There's also, I understand the debate. I remember post-Snowden, I dealt a lot with the Snowden fallout and dealing with that. I remember speaking at the Munich Security Conference, and the CEO of a big company, which was Chatham House Rules, so I won't say what it was, said, we need a Schengen cloud. We need a cloud for Europe. So we have all the data here and it's all controlled. And the 2 major car CEOs, so I won't name, car company CEOs said, that doesn't work for us. We're global companies. We can't store all the data here because we can't operate then. And I think that's true for the financial services. So it's long been a plank of both the US policy to argue against data localization as being, not economically sound, it doesn't really make sense for a lot of reasons. But I think if the best way to argue about that is to create mechanisms where the data is more easily shared, and that's hard because different people have different views. But that's one of the enduring issues. You're absolutely right.
Thank you very much. There was yes to the other end of the room. Yes, thank you.
Thanks for the sharing. I used to work in risk investigation tech sector, so-called trust and safety. And I feel like in this field, the capability or the expertise are really divided by a very niche focus area. So I'm curious about your view on the transferable or common traits that you find crucial for folks that are interested in cyber diplomacy in an entry level. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. And I think, as I said, you don't have to be someone who's deep in the technology to work in diplomacy. Just like, you don't have to be deep in the technology to do other forms of diplomacy. Does it help? Yeah. I mean, if you know what the trade space is, it helps. In other words, people complain. I talked about these meetings in the UN, and one of the challenges was to get other stakeholders there. They created a system where one state could object. The UN wasn't really built for other stakeholders, it was built for countries. But if one country objected, and it was always Russia, by the way, they objected to Microsoft, they objected to all these civil society organizations. Anyone in the West, they objected to Chatham House, although they eventually got in others, were blocked. But if you don't have that, and diplomats, general diplomats, they might have some experience, and some do, but most don't, and so you need that view. So this idea, which the US has been strongly championing for years, in Europe too, of multi-stakeholderism, of having not just governments drive this, and this is true for internet governance, it's true for how the internet's actually run, it's true for cybersecurity, is really important. Now that said, to be a diplomat in this area, we created a training program at State. First of all, we had a cadre, another thing Jim did. He asked every embassy to have someone who was dedicated to this area. So every embassy had someone. They might have been 3 different hats or 10 different hats they had. Some of the bigger embassies like China or Russia, maybe you had 4 people just doing this. But we had expertise in each of these different agencies, posts. Great. They didn't really know what we were trying to do. So we then created these training programs where we brought them all together. And we had Vince Cerf, who created the internet, helped create the internet, talk to them about how the internet works. And we had other people. We did a little technical briefing first. Then we talked about the diplomatic issues, the international issues, the strategy for going forward among the different pillars we were talking about, both security, economic, and human rights. But having that grounding, I think, is important. I don't expect you to be, I don't expect you to be a doctor, but I expect you to be, someone who is at least, a medical aide who can understand a little bit. In my old office, when I created it, I had a senior technical advisor who was the guy who helped invent the cell phone. He was a retired Motorola engineer, and that was very valuable. Again, you can go that, and I can talk to companies and others. So you don't have to do it, but I think if you have some grounding in that, it's not bad. But also you need people who can be translators, who can translate between the tech people who sometimes are not the best communicators in the world and diplomats who are often not the best technical people in the world, to make that connection, and policymakers. And I think that's really important. You need people just understand diplomacy, and that's not, you need all these different skills. So my advice to you is, yeah, get some background in that area, but it's not, that's not dispositive.
Good. Let's move to this side. I see a hand raised there in the middle.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Painter. My name is Manshulika. I come from Thailand. I used to work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, handling cybersecurity and cybercrime issues. So Thailand is interested in designing our own cyber diplomacy strategy. And I would like to know, for the US case, how did the US decide where to station your cyber diplomats? Because we all have limited resources, and we cannot have cyber diplomats in every embassy. And I know that Canadian diplomat, they station like cyber diplomat responsible for Southeast Asia in Singapore. So I would like to know that for the US system. That is my first question. My second question is about, I would like to know your assessment about the cyber attribution trend. I observed that there have been a lot of like political attribution, countries coming out and say like China or Russia is behind this cyber attack. Do you think that this kind of political attribution is an effective tool for accountability or deterrence, or should there be any other tools to create a less like more conducive environment for cooperation, be it like legal or technical attribution? Thank you.
So let me answer the second one first and the first one second. The second one, yeah. So attribution by nation states is always going to be a political decision, right? If that public attribution is always going to be political. They may not do it publicly. They may do it. They may whisper it in the ear of the side that's doing it. They could have private dialogues. They can have it among other countries. When we did the Chinese intellectual property, the difference was we did that publicly. But then a lot of other European countries didn't. Actually, the first country to do that was Germany. Angela Merkel was the first one to call it out, but nothing happened, and so I think they moved on. But then a lot of other countries were quietly saying to China, this is a big deal, and that, I think, helped it move along. So in that sense, public attribution helps. And there has been this trend, since the North Korea Sony attack, there's been more and more of these public attributions. I mentioned NotPetya and WannaCry, where coalitions of countries have come together. It's always better if it's a coalition. If it's just one country, people are like, oh, that's just the US calling out Russia or China again. But if you have a group of countries doing it, I think it gives it more weight. That's not that easy to do, because it's not only figuring out the attribution so that it's comfortable. You don't want to be wrong. Political attribution doesn't have particular standards. It's not like when I was a prosecutor, beyond a reasonable doubt. It's, you think you have enough evidence. In the US system, it was high confidence. That was the Intel term. You wanted to have high confidence this was true, because you don't want to look like an idiot if it turns out not to be. So generally there's that. But then you have to coordinate among countries to do this. And more that's been done. Interestingly, France and Germany would never do public attribution until just recently, and they started doing it. So it's something that takes systems getting used to. I know in the US, when you tell our Intel community, oh, we're going to say something publicly, they say, why would you say that? When we did the China thing, and I said, we know you did this and this. It took like a year to get through our system, because they were like, why would you say? Tell them. They know what they're doing. It's like, well, there's a reason to do this. It's a diplomatic reason to do this. So I think it's important, because it helps educate the public. It helps build coalitions, but it's not enough. It absolutely is not enough. I mean, Russia, if you call out Russia and say you did this, they're going to deny it, but also it's a badge of honor for them. They don't. It's not going to change your behavior. It's ridiculous to think it's going to change your behavior. So for deterrence purposes, it may be a predicate, but it's not enough. And that's why I get into the discussion of consequences. And there could be a range of them. I mean, I don't want to be escalatory. I'm not saying you should have military consequences. You're not going to have kinetic consequences, unless there's actual death. We've talked a lot about what constitutes an act of force in cyberspace, and it's not different in the real world. If there's death and serious bodily injury, it doesn't matter if it's cyber or physical, it's the same. But I think people keep thinking, oh, you need that level, and you don't. And you can respond by economic sanctions. The U.S. Has done this. We have a sanctions order that was written while I was still there. It's been used many times. The Europeans were really happy that they came up with what's called the diplomatic toolkit, which is essentially a sanctions package. I frankly thought it would never get used because it required unanimity, and Europe is a diverse place. But still, it's been used many times actually, and that's another tool in your toolbox. Another is diplomatic pressure, both on the person who's doing it and building coalitions with other countries. So there's a range of action, and then there's out of bound. There are things you can do in trade and other things that may have no relation to cyber. In fact, it's better that they don't, to put pressure on a country. So there's lots of things you can do. There is an issue with some, how effective they can be over time, because North Korea, what sanctions are you doing in North Korea you haven't already done? What can you do to really change your behavior? And so that's why I think there's this debate on deterrence, because how can you change behavior? And there's a lot of interesting studies out there. There's one the Defense Science Board did years ago, which says you have to tailor it to the individual adversary. You have to say, what do they care about? I would argue Putin probably cares about, and his clique probably care about their own finances. If you go after their finances, if they have real estate holdings and say, I don't know, London, if you go after those, maybe that would change their behavior. So I think we have to think about how that's done in a broader way. It's a great question, because I think that's one of the debates that keeps going on here. On the issue of Thailand, we did have someone in each embassy, but it wasn't, as I said, it wasn't a dedicated person necessarily, and we built it over time. The UK has a similar system, not in every embassy, but a number. Canada does that too. More and more countries have done this. Some have done it regionally, as you suggested. Singapore is a hub for ASEAN, and there's a lot of work that Singapore has done in that area, both in capacity building and bringing together the Singapore Cyber Week. We bring all the ASEAN ministers together. So, that's good. So you can do it regionally. But you also focus on what are issues that for Thailand are big issues. What are countries that either pose a certain amount of threat to you or you want to cooperate with, and try to make the decision on that basis and go forward. But I think there's lots of different ways to do it. And I'm glad that Thailand is building this capability. I will say there's some good, happy to talk more about this. Those articles I talked about as resources, there's a lot of good stuff that looks at how that's been done and how that's been trained, because that's the second part. You just don't create the network and then don't feed it. Training is part of it. Part of it is also, there are these things, I'm sure that's true mostly in diplomatic communities, but in the State Department, the cables. They're not cables anymore. but the idea of cables, one of the major things we did was we created a reporting code. This seems stupid. We created a reporting code for cyber, CYB. And that meant that suddenly all these posts were sending us information. And so we got information from the field, and then we could send information back. And you can't be everywhere. And having those resources in countries to come back and raise these issues through demarches or just discussions was critically important. Then another part of it is we had a lot of these dialogues with those countries. And we now have, I think, like 25 of them. We had an EU dialogue, but we also had individual dialogues with France and with Germany and with the UK and the Nordic and Baltic countries, among others, and Italy too. So you can have these dialogues, which are all of government dialogues. It's not just the foreign ministry going. I brought the defense ministry, or Department of Defense. I brought the Department of Homeland Security. I brought DOJ. I brought commerce for the economic thing. So we can have a full discovery, full dialogue. And one of the interesting things, the first one I did that with was Japan. And the US is kind of stovepiped, it's siloed in some ways. Japan is too. So the first meeting, we had 15 agencies on our side. They had 20 on their side. Most of them had never talked to each other before, and they were taking notes on each other's presentation. And the last one I did was also Japan. And by then, it was a lot more confluence. So it actually has an ability to build closer connections. But happy to talk to you more about it. That's good.
May I perhaps ask a follow-up question on your former answer because I was struck by the fact that what you described was let's say, an enforcement system which relies heavily on the response of individual states or group of states, which is, in a way, unilateral justice is by definition a fairly primitive system in terms of the construction of justice. So I was trained as a lawyer too, I must say, and I did a bit of international law. And well, in other areas, thought was given to a system of, let's say, third-party adjudication. And I'm curious to hear whether this has been the case at all. I understand that we're at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, certainly people have, I'm not taking off my jacket just because it's a difficult question. But, you know, people have talked about that a lot. But then if you think about how practically that works, look, if the UN, if there were reforms in the UN where you could have some of these discussions, that might be good. But it's not just the Russians and the Chinese who do not want that in the UN. It's the US and the West that don't want that in the UN either because they don't trust the outcome, I think. And so, and people have proposed things like a joint global, either UN or not global attribution agency. Let me tell you why that's never going to work. One is it's very political, right? So you create this body, you know, maybe put it at ICRC, the International Red Cross, or somewhere else. You create this body. If I'm a country and you know, the data I'm using to know, say, X attacked Y, some of that's going to be classified data. I'm not going to share that data with you know, some international body. I'll share like publicly available data, which may only tell half the story, so this international body might get it wrong, and that's more destabilizing than not. Is there going to be trust built among some body like that? It'd be very, very hard to do that. And you know, a good example is when we indicted. Well, we said it was North Korea, as I said. You know, Obama came out and said it was North Korea. Everyone said it was North Korea before Obama came out and said it was North Korea. And then, you know, a famous computer scientist, Bruce Schneider, who I like, even he said it was North Korea. But then we released more evidence than we ever released before. You know, law enforcement evidence, other evidence, and then he said, "Oh, it's not North Korea," because I looked at their evidence and it's not enough. And of course, we didn't release every piece of evidence we had because we're not going to release everything because it also gives a roadmap to the bad guys of how we found out. And so you always have this tension that when you're dealing with these attribution issues, same, you know, and some of the other attributions where you would have Russia saying, show us absolute proof. You know, we don't believe you unless you show us absolute proof. Absolute proof doesn't exist in life. It doesn't, not just in cyber, it just doesn't exist. It didn't exist when I was a prosecutor. That was beyond a reasonable doubt. So, you know, that was more a way to hide behind this attribution question. So all of that leads me to, and then on Bruce Schneider's comment, he said there wasn't, 3 years later, there was a 65-page criminal complaint that really detailed everything we had. And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I guess it was North Korea." so you're always going to be trapped with that. So as attractive as that is, because it is, I mean, just from a you know, foreign policy and law standpoint, I just don't see it working, at least in the short term, in the geopolitical. I mean, the other issue, as I said in the beginning, geopolitics, this is not a unique issue. It's grounded in larger geopolitical concerns. And given our current geopolitical situation, that's affected the UN. They got a consensus. It was a consensus process in this OEWG. Not a lot of progress, though, because if you're trying to get a consensus with countries with such different worldviews, you're not going to get much. And I think that's where we are on that. Is that? I don't know if that's satisfactory, but that's the answer.
Yeah, I assume it's a fair description of the way things are for the time being, and we may always dream of a different world, but we should know how it looks like. I think, yes, the gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Florian. I work for a German think tank in the field of cybersecurity. You mentioned the case of Ukraine, and well, somehow we might overestimated the role cyber can actually play right now on the battlefield. I'm thinking more like about the future battlefield when intercommunication between systems plays a bigger role, when such as 6th generation fighter jets, they need a constant connection to servers. Would you say cyber can or will take the role in the future battlefield we might thought it already can?
I mean, and potentially. I mean, already you have militaries doing exercises like a day without cyber. What happens if we didn't have any cyber connectivity? How does that affect our weapon systems and others? And they should do that because you need that level of resilience. But I still think it's not going to be core. I mean, you need that capability, and even Germany has a cyber command too. For instance, they've founded that. I met the person who was the head of that a few years ago. So a lot of these countries have focused on that issue, which I think is important. But I don't think it's going to be dispositive. I mean, I think it's going to be one arrow in the quiver, basically. And you saw this with Ukraine. I was a little worried, not worried. I mean, I'm just worried about Ukraine generally, but there was this narrative after the beginning of the war that, everyone was saying, cyber is going to be this dispositive big thing, and it wasn't. And part of the narrative was like, we were wrong. It's not that big a deal. Also wrong, right? So it is a big deal. It's not going to be the only element in war when you have a physical war. Now, prior to actually a physical incursion, I think it's going to play even a bigger role, and that's what we see today with the disruptions that are going on. In Europe and other places, not just disinformation, but actual critical infrastructure disruption. So yeah, I mean, I do think there's a danger of it, especially with there's a whole host of things you can do with AI systems. We can talk a long time about how you can poison AI systems, how you could do prompt injection, how you could do all these bad things that will create really, especially what they call agentic AI, which is AI agents who are essentially autonomous. There's all kinds of bad problems with that, and I suspect that's going to transfer to the military as well.
Thank you. Let's move forward. Yes, over here.
Hey, Mr. Painter. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, and thank you for your government service. I wanted to talk a little bit more about AI. Right now in the United States, there's a lot of calls for regulation on AI, and a lot of people have likened the competition for AI to artificial general intelligence, the AGI, with China as almost like a space race. Mm-hmm. How can the U.S. kind of grapple with both sides, trying to beat China to the finish line to get AGI without sacrificing some of our morals or laws?
Again, a good question. I would say it's probably even worse than the space race because at least the sense where the narrative, whether this is true or not, it's the first one to the goal was going to create, control the world, basically. I don't know if that's really true, but that's at least the hype. And I think the problem, and this has driven some U.S. policy. So under the Biden administration, there was AI executive orders that created guardrails, talked about responsible use of AI, imposed a lot of barriers, not like the AI Act in the EU, which I think is even more restrictive. Obviously China doesn't have an AI Act or AI executive orders, or Russia doesn't, and I don't think Russia is really a player here. I do think the big players, as you said, are China and the U.S. Eric Schmidt was speaking at a conference about a year ago in London, and he had the view the only players are China and the U.S. That Europe has made themselves irrelevant by regulating themselves out of existence. Again, you can have different views on that. But what we've seen with the Trump administration is those executive orders were taken down. They're gone. The new ones have some protections in place. They create this AI ICE Act. They have these ideas. There's some things about model integrity and things like that, but not a lot, right? So, and I think that's because the Trump administration views this as existential, and we need to get to that goal first, and any regulations be damned, which is also their view generally on things. But regulations be damned, controls be damned, and that itself is worrying, right? Because we don't know where this technology is going. So, I think people struggle with this. I've struggled with this too. How can we actually keep our values, and I think this is what the EU is trying to do, keep our values in mind as we're developing this technology and how it's used, including privacy aspects, how it can, the kind of recognition it can do and the kind of way it can aid suppression of free speech. There's a lot of bad things that come. There are a lot of good things, but there's a lot of bad things that come out of AI. And I worry that there's not enough. There's a lot of talk, but there's not enough real focus on that yet. Now, on the other hand, it's still evolving, right? I think we're not really near that stage. It's like quantum computing and post-quantum encryption, which is another area I didn't talk about. It's not happened yet. So we have to worry about these things. I'm worried that maybe we're not taking it as seriously in the U.S. as we should be.
Thank you so much for sharing. You also talk about the U.S.-China dialogue between the cyberspace you talk about, and also the question about U.S.-China AI competition. So it seems like it's in U.S. and China's mutual interest to form some sort of norm or consensus on cyberspace and AI. But do you think that will happening? Do you think is that a possibility? If not, what are some of the biggest roadblock for that kind of collaboration?
So, I do think it's important. And look, I was a diplomat, but I was also a prosecutor. But I do believe it's important to have dialogue even with countries you disagree with. And given China's role and the U.S.'s role, and there have been some dialogues, as you mentioned, on AI. I don't know the current status of them. I don't think they're really doing a lot right now, given the overall environment. There are, I thought it was important for us to have a dialogue with China. We had one for many years, as I said, a whole of government dialogue. We had track 2 dialogues with Kicker in China, the Chinese Institute for Contemporary International Relations, and CSIS in the U.S., Jim Lewis, and those are good track 2s. And we had the track 1, which when our Department of Justice indicted several Chinese PLA actors for intellectual property theft, that was cut off. But then we created it again after the negotiation. So I think it's important to have that. There's no real dialogue like that now. And you don't want to have a dialogue, even as diplomats, you don't want to have a dialogue just for the sake of having a dialogue. You want to have a practical outcome. And I do think there's enough at stake that's important to continue to talk about these issues. I do. I think there has to be transparency on both sides. There has to be a focus on what you're trying to achieve. One of the reasons I think there's been resistance to starting, because I also led our Russian-U.S. dialogue, where we had bilateral CBMs and stuff that came out of them. But when they invaded Ukraine the first time, that got cut off. And it's still important to talk to them, but at the same time, you just don't want to have a dialogue for the sake of saying, hey, we're having a dialogue, everything's okay, which is, I think, what the Russian response was. But I do think it's important to have these discussions and understanding, even if you fundamentally disagree. And it also takes a while to get beyond the rhetoric in the beginning. Now, what are the challenges? Well, I mentioned these. I think there is this, first of all, I don't think it depends on the administration in the U.S. Again, Jim Steinberg, we did before the first Trump administration, we had there was a think tank dialogue in Shanghai. And I was the only cyber person on it, but it was mostly like other issues. But Jim started out by saying, look, it doesn't matter who wins the election in terms of U.S.-China relationships. It's a problem for both parties now. There's not going to be the return to the dialogues that we had right away. And I think that tension continues, and certainly continues under the Trump administration. And it's exacerbated by things like the Salt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon. I think that as long as, and I'm sure China would view the U.S. as an attacker too, and they've attributed some of the attacks to them, to the U.S., and even said that some of these things were made up. So as long as that tension is there, that's going to be one of the things that's going to be problematic. But again, it's part of the larger geopolitical issue. As long as the tensions are at the top on a whole range of issues, it's going to be very hard to have constructive discussions about this issue, Jim.
Let's go back. Yes, on the back. Over there, yes.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. I just have a question. Since you mentioned the Iran problem regarding cyber attacks, it just suddenly occurred to me, it reminded me of an FBI notice you may have seen on social media recently about 3 Iranian cyber actors. And there's a $10 million reward, which is offered for information leading to their capture, I suppose. First of all, I apologize if it sounds like me asking for personal business advice, but it also has a broader geopolitical dimension, which I'm sure will interest everyone in this room. I was just wondering if you happen to have any practical advice for an investigator regarding how to go about doing this. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's tough because I would think, my guess is those actors are well insulated within Iran, so it'd be very hard for you to get to them, just like a lot of the North Korean actors are. And people have questioned, why does our Department of Justice, by the way, when I was at DOJ, when I talked to people about indicting foreign government officials, they said, oh, we don't do that because if we don't see them in a court, if we have no realistic idea of a chance of getting in the courtroom, we're not going to do it. But now they do it routinely, right? So when they go after Russian and other actors or North Korean actors or Iranian actors, they're unlikely to see them. It does have an effect in limiting the travel of those folks because they can be picked up on Interpol warrants, red notices, and other things. it does affect their lives in some ways. So, and the reason I think these indictments are done is also an educational purpose, to say, we know what you're doing. These are what we call speaking indictments, which means it tells a story. It tells you how you got there. Not everything, but it tells you how you get there. And I think that helps educate people. But as far as actually getting the people, and one of the reasons these reward, this is the Rewards for Justice program, I think, at State set up, is it does create uncomfortableness for them. If they do travel, people will go after them. And so, like, that's exactly what you're asking. But I don't have any real tips on how you get the people if they never leave the country, which I suspect they won't.
Thank you. We have a question here on the front row, and we'll gradually bring this session to an end because we move on.
Hello, my name is Jasper Rugemer, and I just have a question on accountability and further deterrence. I want to focus specifically on elections, knowing that this has been big in the EU and the US. Let's say there is a violation, right? And a foreign actor is then held accountable. How, first of all, would you hold them accountable? And then second, how do you prevent that from going into further escalation? Because I think that's what everybody's holding back on in terms of accountability, is to avoid further escalation. So thank you very much.
So a lot of people, I was one of those people, worried, after the election interference in 2016, which did happen, even though some people now say it didn't, there was, I think, some concern of, okay, if we do too much, we're in a glass house. The countries that are attacking us may not be as dependent on these technologies as we are, and they'll attack us, and we have lots of vulnerabilities. That's almost self-deterrence, though. So I think we moved beyond that and said, no, we'll take action, various actions. But then the question is, what actions are going to be effective, right? And I think you have to look at, again, the range of different things. And there have been people who have written papers about escalation as too trumped up, that we've been so afraid of escalation that we really haven't seen it, even the times we've taken action. I think that we don't have enough data for that yet, but I think maybe we have overemphasized escalation. Of course, we don't want things escalating out of control. How you deal with cyber and what the escalation path is still very unclear because it's still pretty new. Although I'd say if it's causing death and destruction, that's going to be a different escalation path than if it's simply stealing data. But election interference goes to the heart and soul of democracy, right? And so we've seen this in Europe, we've seen this in the US. And we did a number of things. The first time that cyber sanctions order was used, we did it 2 years earlier, every time I testified before Congress, they were like, are you going to use it? And I said, yeah. And we finally did in that case. We also closed down some of the missions. We went after a bunch of companies. It was funny, I'm not going to say who this is, very senior State Department official and me were having this argument after the election interference of how we respond. So the White House wanted response options. We were coming up with various ones. And she said to me, well, we should shut off the lights in Moscow. I said, no, no, we shouldn't have. No, that'd be escalating. No, that's no and no. It's a violation of international law. It doesn't actually, I don't even know if we can do it. Assuming we could do it, no and no. And she said, well, you're just being a cyber nice guy. I said, well, we should PNG their diplomats. And she goes, oh, we can't do that. They'll just PNG ours. And so it was this, someone who had not much cyber background, but a deep, deep diplomatic background, talking to someone who kind of understood that aspect. And I think we've been better at bridging the gap, but finding the right buttons to press that actually have the effect is very, very difficult. I totally agree. Look, election interference continues. We did use that. Our hotline, we used the hotline to basically say that Obama also called Putin and said, knock it off. It didn't really help. So, I think you have to have some teeth in that, but I think you have to figure out what those teeth are that actually have an effect.
Thank you. Well, given the topic, I think it may make sense to address one online question,
Sure.
Which is, what about developing countries? Because it's fair to say that we've been talking about a lot about the same gang of 4 or 5 countries. So what's for the rest of the world? How big an issue is this? And is there something to be done in order to assist and support?
Absolutely. I mean, so every country in the world is hanging their hat on digitization, on the promise of having digital economies. That this is going to be the new frontier for them. They're worried about AI passing them by. They're worried about not having the capability. And so that means investment both in the innovation and the digital part of it, but also investment in cybersecurity is a way, if you don't have a trustworthy system, people are not going to invest in you. You're not going to have foreign investment. You're not going to have the ability. Cybersecurity is not an end to itself. It's a road that actually supports all the good things we're trying to do on the internet, which I really didn't talk about much this time, but there's lots of good things we're trying to do this time. So the developing world has been a big focus. And so one of the things I did after I left the State Department is one of the aspects of my group there was this idea of capacity building and engaging with countries. So we did talk to regional organizations like the Organization for American States, ASEAN, the African Union about this. And there was a big desire by those countries to do more in this. And I said, we had the first meeting of this open-ended working group. We're discussing these like very highfalutin concepts of deterrence and norms. A lot of these countries are like, we just need help. We need help to actually have things like national strategies, national level certs, coordination mechanisms with their governments, way of dealing with the private sector. A lot of countries don't have any history of actually dealing with stakeholders outside of government. So all these things was a major pillar of going and working and having, in Africa, we did every regional group of Africa and did the AU to create this. Then when I left the government, I was the president of something called the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which is a platform with 63 different countries, about 200 civil society, academia, and other groups, which is focused on coordinating and promoting capacity building. And there is an African hub, there's an ASEAN hub, there is a OAS hub. There's a lot of work within Europe to focus on that because, from a developed country, it makes sense for that to happen because, again, you can win their hearts and minds. You can say why our method makes sense. But you also have a practical element. If you build capability in these countries, if I'm a smart attacker, I'm going to route the attack through the weakest spot, where they don't have good laws, where they don't have good capabilities, where they might have good bandwidth, but that's it, right? So, and if those countries don't have the capability of working with me to ameliorate that, that creates a problem for me. So there is a practical reason, even for countries who are nationalistic or America first or whatever they are, that actually helps you get through that. So I do think capacity building is critically important. And that's one of the things these countries want. But they also want a voice. So one of the things in the UN is we saw, we had regional group, the Pacific Islands led by Fiji and others who were very, very good and very vocal and very dedicated. And they want to be playing in these things. It's not just the P5 that are calling the shots. They may have the biggest stakes right now, but in the future, the other ones will too. I worry that with the significant cuts to cut of USAID and some of the other capacity building programs, and also cuts not just limited to the US, but we see that in European countries too, as they're prioritizing other issues, including the fear of war with Russia, that we'll lose that narrative and we'll lose that ability to help these countries, and they'll turn to a more restrictive narrative because they like regime stability too, but they also want economic growth. And I think if you link the cyber part with the economic growth part, you have a much better chance of making progress.
Thank you. Well, it's clear from the number of hands raised that I saw a minute ago that we could go on for another hour, but I think it's proper to bring this conversation to an end. It's clear that we have a lot of work to do in order to make sense of the system, which is itself being shaped up. But I want really to thank you warmly for having given us a bit of your time and helped us to understand what is at stake. So please join me in thanking our guest for his contribution.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. I really wish you great careers, but also if there's anything you need from me, I generally am pretty good at giving back to people if I don't lose the emails. So happy to talk more.
Thank you. And have a nice evening.
I'll end on a light note. So, I told a joke in the beginning. I'll end with another cyber joke. So, a hacker is walking down the beach and he finds a lamp and he rubs it, and predictably enough, a genie comes out. And the genie says, "Look, you get 3 wishes, but because you're a hacker, there's some strings attached." This used to be a lawyer joke, by the way. There's some strings attached. Everything you wish for, every other hacker gets twice as much of. And the hacker's, okay, I can deal with that. Well, I won 1 million Bitcoin. So he gets 1 million Bitcoin, but every other hacker gets 2 million Bitcoins. You know, hackers are kind of competitive people. It kind of annoys them. It's, what's your best, the second wish? And it goes, you know, I want 1 million stolen credentials. So he gets 1 million stolen credentials, but every other hacker gets 2 million stolen credentials. And again, just irks him. And the genie says, look, I got to get back in the bottle. I want to watch I Dream of Genie reruns. What's your third wish? And the hacker pauses and he thinks about it and says, I'd like to donate a kidney. So every other hacker donates 2 kidneys, they all die. So the message of that joke is that it really is something that's evolving, but it really requires, and I know this is almost trite, but partnership between countries. The diplomatic aspect is really important. Working with the private sector is important. And with that, have a good day.